Last week, I gave you kind of like a broad overview of myths that are used often to say, well, Jesus is just a repeat of those type of things, right? We showed you the nice film. Again, apologize, no popcorn. Just 10 minutes of Zeitgeist. It's available to watch. It's really a spectacle when you watch the whole 2 hours of it, not to mention the addendums. But that's the type of information that's out there. So we want to continue to explore this comparison, right? Jesus as compared to the myths that are usually attributed to being there. So usually it's this copycat type of mentality, right? Well, Jesus is just the latest in a long line of copycats of, themes of gods and other myths that have come along before, well before Jesus was there. And he's just the latest and greatest of that. And believe it or not, it's really easy to find information. You can literally just do myth verses, and the first thing that pops up by autocomplete on Google is Jesus. And there are numerous websites that want to talk about myth of Jesus. Wikipedia has an entire page just on myths versus Jesus. It's great if you like Wikipedia. So, let's continue on the theme. If you remember, part of last week I talked about the companion to the Zeitgeist movie. The companion to the Zeitgeist movie basically told us that the Horus myth was not told in a linear fashion. And because it wasn't told in a linear fashion, in order for us to appropriately compare it to the Jesus myth, we should not consider Jesus in a linear fashion. So I wanted us to break it apart. We've decided that just doesn't make sense, right? If you're going to break things apart and take bits and pieces and compare them and make them that makes it really easy to say, this is exactly the same as this, look. So, my Hyundai is exactly the same as Adam's Red Bull van, right? Well, don't look at it as a whole. If you break it down in individual pieces, they each have tires. So obviously they're the same thing. Not only do they have tires, but they each have engines. So they're obviously the same thing, right? The Hyundai is probably newer than the van, so it's obviously just a copy of the van. On a smaller scale, of course, but it's a copy of it. You see how that just doesn't make sense? It's if you break anything down into small enough components, you can compare it to anything and say, well, it's the same thing, right? An electric lawnmower versus a coffee maker. Well, they both run off of electricity. They both have wiring inside, so they're the same thing. And you can continue to do that, and you can pretty much exhaust yourself looking at all those different comparisons. One of the things that kind of sets Christianity apart, other than just the fact that it is in a linear fashion, and it does include all of these things, it's a complete cohesive body of works known as the Bible, right? It is the most complete history, literally, of any religion. There is no other religion that has a complete, fulfilled history available in a text. Now, you'll say, but James, there's other holy books, right? They obviously must have something, but they don't go into the history of things. They don't show the full scale of things. They talk about the religious figure, and they talk about the religious figure sayings, and that's the extent of them. They don't talk in depth the way that the Bible does and give it some anchor, some historic proof, some evidence. But let's put the Bible aside for. I've been joking kind of all morning that you don't need the Bible for today. And it's kind of weird to stand up here and to be given a sermon and say, you don't need your Bibles. Even Joel Osteen says this is his Bible and he believes what it says. But That's beside the point. So, if you discount the Bible and you take that away, the question becomes, would there still be evidence for Jesus as the historical figure, Jesus as the Messiah, Jesus as the Son of God? Because that's basically what the myth are saying, right? That it's just a copy and the Bible was just hobbled together as the newest iteration of all these myths. So what if you take that away? You no longer have the Bible, right? That's the biggest argument is, we're always arguing from a biblical perspective, but they discount the Bible completely, so there's no common basis. Let's take it away. Did you know that of the major religions of the world, unless you're talking about Christian authors, there is not a plethora, that means many, there is not a plethora of writings against other religions and myths, unless you're talking about from Christian authors specifically. Now, there are tons of writings against Christianity. They are so easy to find. Arguments against, it's all over the place. There are verifiable sources that we can look at that would argue against Christ, but using those very types of manuscripts, using those writings, you can actually verify the tale of Christ. Because we're not talking about modern day type of thing. We're talking about some ancient non-biblical authors giving their pagan accounts, and I think that we should do that. Now, this isn't exciting. It's no pomp and circumstance like a movie or anything. I try to just do one exciting thing a month, but we're going to have to do a lot of reading, and I do apologize for that. And I don't expect you to write down everything that these manuscripts say, but you might want to take some names and some dates, that type of thing. They are freely available because we do have access through the internet, but we should get started and take a look at that. If we can verify the person of Jesus without using the Bible, how strengthened is our argument when we include the Bible as well? That's the question. So let's get started. So there are a number of ancient classic accounts of Jesus from pagan, non-Christian sources, and they are generally hostile towards Christianity. I'm not going to lie. Some of these ancient authors denied the miraculous nature of Jesus and some of the events surrounding his life. So there's not like a complete laid out, this is the full history of Jesus from any one source other than the Bible. In 52 AD, there is a secular writer whose name is Thallus, Thallus. Now, he is so ancient that literally none of his writings exist anymore. None of his writings exist. However, there are other writers who quote him in their writings. So, one of those people is Julius Africanus. Sounds like part of the evolutionary chain. Anyway, Julius Africanus. He wrote around 221 AD, and he quotes Thallus, who tried to explain the darkness occurring at Jesus' crucifixion. So this is a miraculous event trying to be explained by an author in 52 AD, being quoted by an author in 221 AD. Let's see. On the whole world there was pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus in the third book of his history calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. Julius Africanus in his chronography 18:1. So, In the quoted text, Thales said it appeared as an eclipse. The ground shook. Judea and the surrounding area sunk down. That's interesting when you think about it. That's a possible explanation. It sounds reasonable, an eclipse of the sun. Does anybody know when the Passover festival takes place? No? The Passover festival always takes place, coincidentally, no, by plan, during a full moon. There are two things that cannot happen at the same time. You cannot have a full moon and a solar eclipse. So we know for a fact that it's not a solar eclipse, because that is an impossibility, astronomically speaking. If only we could find more of Thales' record, we might be able to find more confirmation of Jesus' crucifixion, but there are some things that we know for sure. Based on Thales' writing alone, we know that Jesus lived, he was crucified, there was an earthquake, and there was darkness at the point of his crucifixion. So we've already confirmed that there was a person named Jesus, and he was crucified, and the skies went dark and the earth shook. Let's look at other evidences. Tacitus, Tacitus. He was alive between 56 and 120 AD. First name Cornelius. He's known for his analysis and examination of the historical documents, and he is considered one of the most trusted ancient historians. He was a senator under Emperor Vespasian and a proconsul of Asia. In his Annals of 1116 AD, he describes the Emperor Nero's response to the Great Fire in Rome. Now, this is something that may be sparking a little something in your memory, even from public school. Nero fiddling, supposedly, as Rome burnt. Probably no actual fiddling took place, just so you're aware. Tacitus writes, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had his origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Interesting account, but there is a couple of things. So in this account, Tacitus confirms several historical elements that we find in the biblical narrative, right? Jesus lived in Judea, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and he had followers that were persecuted for their faith. Right? Question? When did he write about this? He wrote about it in 116 AD. All right, so already just after two authors, we know that Jesus lived, he was crucified, there was an earthquake and darkness. He lived in Judea, and he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and he had many followers. We're learning a lot, and we haven't even touched the Gospels. We're not going to. I'm just saying we haven't. Okay. There's also another one that I'm not going to read, but I'm just going to mention as a footnote. He was writing to his son, and he did compare the life and persecution of Jesus to what other philosophers were going through. His name was Mara bar Serapion, and that was around 70 AD. And the reason I'm not reading through it is because he refers to Jesus just as the wise king. and basically says that what did the Jews benefit from killing their wise king? That's about it. There's also Phlegon, Phlegon. He was around 80 to 114 AD. Similar to Thallus Julius Africanus, the same historian, mentions Phlegon, who wrote a chronicle history of around 140 AD. He mentions also the darkness surrounding the crucifixion. Phlegon records that in the time of Tiberius Caesar at the full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th to the 9th hour. See, again, we know that that is not a possibility. But it does confirm that it was at the time of the full moon and there was an eclipse. Origen, against Celsus, also wrote in regards to this, within regard to the eclipse at the time of Tiberius Caesar, in whose reign Jesus appears to have been crucified, and the great earthquakes which then took place. Jesus, while alive, was of no assistance to himself, but that he rose after death and exhibited the marks of his punishment and showed his hands had been pierced by nails. So from this account, we can add to our list of things that we have learned that Jesus had the ability to accurately predict his future. He was crucified under the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and he demonstrated his wounds after he had been resurrected. Everybody still awake? All right. This is like high school AP classes, right? So that was Origen quoting Phlegon. Yes. Let's move on to Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger is the nephew of Pliny the Elder. Runs in the family. So early Christians were also described early in non-Christian history. Pliny the Younger, in a letter to the Roman Emperor Trajan, Pliny, P-L-I-N-Y, the Younger. So writing to the Emperor Trajan, he describes the lifestyles of early Christians. They, the Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verse a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to do any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word or deny a trust when they could be called upon to deliver it up. After which, it is their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. Riveting stuff. So, from this we learn that the first Christians believed that Jesus was God, and they upheld a high moral code, and they met regularly to worship Jesus. All right, I've got two more pagan writers, and then we'll start talking about some Jewish writers. Let's talk about Suetonius. S-U-E-T-O-N-I-U-S. He's a Roman historian. He was alive from 69 to 140 AD. He is a historian and analyst of the imperial house under Emperor Hadrian, and his writings about Christians describe their treatment under Claudius between 41 and 54. He said, because the Jews at Rome caused constant disturbances at the instigation of Christos, the Christ, he, Claudius, expelled them from the city. The expulsion took place about 49 AD, and in another work, Suetonius writes about the fire as well, and the punishment for Christians, saying, Nero inflicted punishment on the Christians, a sect given to a new and mischievous religious belief. Basically, we learn from this that Christ's followers were committed to their belief that Jesus was God, and they withstood torment and punishment from the Roman Empire. So it is clear that Jesus had an immediate and curious impact on his followers' life, encouraged them even to die courageously for what they knew to be true. So we literally have people within 30 years of Christ's death and resurrection that are willing to die for what they believe to be true. Keep that in mind. And let's talk about Celsus, C-E-L-S-U-S. So this is the last hostile non-Christian account we'll examine. Celsus was an antagonistic person to the Gospels. His criticisms, though, unwittingly kind of confirmed things for us. So they affirm and reinforce what the biblical authors and their content. He does write extensively, and he alludes to 80 different biblical quotes confirming their early appearance in history. In addition, he admits to the miracles of Jesus that were generally believed in the early 2nd century. So just a small excerpt. Jesus had come from a village in Judea. He was the son of a poor Jewess who gained her living by the work of her own hands. His mother had been turned out of doors by her husband, who was a carpenter by trade, on being convicted of adultery with a soldier named Panthera. Being thus driven away by her husband and wandering about in disgrace, she gave birth to Jesus, a bastard. Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to Egypt. And while he acquired certain magical powers, which the Egyptians pride themselves on possessing, he returned home highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them gave himself out to be a god. Remember, he's antagonistic towards Christianity and the belief of who Jesus is. Celsus does, however, report and admit that Jesus was reportedly born of a virgin, but he argues that it could not be possible because of its supernatural nature. Too much reading. Because of its supernatural nature, so he borrows the idea that he's the illegitimate son of a man named Panthera, an idea borrowed from the Jews who opposed Jesus at the time. Let's see. In his writing accounts, he does confirm several important claims. Jesus had an earthly father who was a carpenter, and Jesus also possessed unusual magical powers and claimed to be a god. And that's just a few. There's a couple of things that I didn't read because I'm trying to keep it sort of brief for you, because I love you. Now, that's pagans. And I say pagan as opposed to they're not Christians and they're not Jews. So let's take a look now at non-biblical Jewish accounts. You ready for this? We're changing gears up now. Those were people that weren't associated with the Jewish faith, with the Jewish people, and weren't associated with Christianity. These are people that are associated with the Jewish faith, the Jewish people, and not with Christianity. So you have a number of ancient hostile Jewish sources that describe Jesus. These include theologians, historians, and leaders, definitely not sympathetic to the Christian cause. They have some harsh things to say, even some demeaning things to say about Jesus, but in doing so, they also confirm certain things. So, probably the most popular, most known would be, see, my mom's already smiling. She knows I'm going to say Josephus. Beth knew it too. See, Josephus is well known. One of the things known about Josephus is he is an egotistical, self-serving, political advisor and he's also a priest. So, he writes about Jesus in his Antiquities of the Jews in 93 AD. He was born 4 years after the crucifixion. He was a consultant for the rabbis. He was a military commander for the Galilean forces at the age of 16. He recorded much of what he saw in the first century. And under Emperor Vespasian, Josephus was allowed to write a history of the Jews, which includes 3 passages that talk about Christianity. One of them is very hotly contested, and we'll touch on that here. But there is one that nobody argues with. And that simply says, in writing about James, in the execution of James, he describes him as James, the brother of Christ. Nobody disputes that. This is the first instance we have. It solidifies for us that, yes, not only was there a person named James who was the head of the church in Jerusalem, he was killed. He was also the brother of Christ. Now, the one passage that's coming up here is hotly contested. It is because his writings were widely available, and people feel that it was easily to manipulate them. So obviously the Christians added words in there and manipulated it. Because they add things about the fact that he was very wise and he did many miraculous signs, and there were certain embellishments that don't seem in line with the way that Josephus would normally write. We'll give him that. We'll take those embellishments out. And we'll just look at the stuff that Josephus wrote that, when compared to his own wording, matches up with his style of writing and the type of thing that he would normally write about. Now, around this time lived Jesus, a wise man. He was a worker of amazing deeds and was a teacher of people who gladly accepted the truth. He won over both many Jews and Greeks, and Pilate, when he heard of him accused by leading men among us, condemned him to the cross. But those who had first loved him did not cease doing so. To this day, the tribe of Christians named after him is not disappeared. That's a denatured reconstruction, removing the embellishments. These are words that, when you take a careful study of the way that he writes, are in line with what he would have written. Let's see. So from this text, we can conclude a couple of different things. Jesus lived in Palestine. He was a wise man, a teacher. He worked amazing deeds. He was accused by the Jews, crucified under Pilate, and had followers called Christians. We're doing great. We're learning a lot about who this Jesus guy is. There is also writings about him in the Jewish Talmud. The Talmud, written between 400 and 700 AD. The earliest writings, these are Jewish rabbis, appear in the 5th century, and the tradition of the authors indicates that they are faithfully transmitting teachings from the early period of the 1st century to the 2nd century AD. So these are people that are transferring writings from an earlier century into the 2nd century. And there are a number of writings that refer to Jesus. They're said to use code words such as Balaam or Ben Stada or certain one. But we'll be very conservative and will limit the use of those other names and look specifically for ones that refer to him in a direct way. So we're going to assume the smallest instead of the largest here. Of the Sanhedrin Shabbat 11.5, Shabbat 104b, it is said that Jesus practiced magic and led Israel astray. Pretty straightforward, short sentence. Then we have a quote from the Sanhedrin 103a. Rabbi Hista said that Rabbi Jeremiah bar Abba said, "What is that which is written? No evil will befall you, nor shall any plague come near your house." Psalms 91:10. No evil shall befall you means that the evil dreams and evil thoughts will not tempt you, nor shall any plague come near your house, which means that you will not have a son or disciple who burns his food like Jesus of Nazareth. Exactly. But he's using Jesus of Nazareth as a negative example, but he is using an actual person of Jesus of Nazareth as that example. From the Sanhedrin 43a, our rabbis have taught that Jesus had 5 disciples: Matthai, Nakai, Nezer, Bunai, and Toda. They brought Matthai to trial, and he said, "Must Matthai be killed? For it is written, 'When Matthai shall I come and appear before God.'" They said, "Yes, Matthai must be killed, for it is written, 'When Matthai dies, his name will perish.'" Psalm 41:5. They brought Nakai and said to them, "Must Nakai be killed? For it is written, 'The innocent, Naki, and the righteous will not slay.'" Exodus 23:7. They said to him, "Yes, Nakai must be killed. For it is written, 'In the secret places he slays the innocent,' Naki." Psalms 10:8. So we know that Jesus had disciples, and at least one of the names of the disciples was Matthai. And the last one from the famous Talmudic passages, it's probably the most famous, the Sanhedrin 43a. You all know it well, right? Right? It is taught, on the day before the Passover, they hanged Jesus. A herald went before him for 40 days proclaiming, "He will be stoned because he practiced magic and enticed Israel to go astray. Let anyone who knows anything in his favor come forward and plead for him." But nothing was found in his favor, and they hanged him on the day before the Passover. So, from these passages mentioning Jesus by name, this is discounting all the ones that use other names that people attribute towards Jesus in the writings. Jesus had magical powers. He led the Jews away from their beliefs. He had disciples who were martyred for their faith, one of whom was named Matthai, and was executed on the day before Passover. There's also the Toldat Yeshua, which is the last one we'll talk about. It is a medieval Jewish retelling of the life of Jesus. It is completely 100% anti-Christ, to be sure. There are many versions of these retellings, and part of them have been transmitted orally and in written tradition of the Jews. We can presume, dating back to Jesus' first appearance as an influential leader who started to draw Jews away from the faith in law. The Toldat Yeshua contains determined effort to explain away the miracles and deny the virgin birth. And in some places the text is quite vicious, but it does confirm many elements of the New Testament writings. So, Jesus is called Yehoshua. Are you ready? In the year 3671, now just to be clear, in Jewish reckoning, that would be around 90 BC. So, 3671, in the days of King Janaeus, a great misfortune befell Israel, when there arose a disputable man of the tribe of Judah, whose name was Joseph Pandera. He lived at Bethlehem in Judah. Near his house dwelt a widow and her lovely and chaste daughter named Miriam. Miriam was betrothed to Johanan of the royal house of David, a man learned in the Torah and God-fearing. And at the close of a certain Sabbath, Joseph Pandera, attractive and like a warrior in appearance, having gazed lustfully upon Miriam, knocked upon her door of her room and betrayed her by pretending he was her betrothed husband, Johanan. Even so, she was amazed at this improper conduct and submitted only against her will. Therefore, when Johanan came to her, Miriam expressed astonishment at the behavior so foreign to his character. It was thus that they both came to know the crime that Joseph Pandera and his terrible mistake on the part of Miriam. Miriam gave birth to a son and named him Yehoshua after her brother. This name later deteriorated to Yeshua. Yeshua is the name for Jesus, and it means, may his name be blotted out. On the 8th day, he was circumcised, and when he was old enough, the lad was taken by Miriam to the house of study to be instructed in the Jewish tradition. And on the day Yeshua walked in the front sages with his head uncovered, showing shameful disrespect. And at this, the discussion arose as to whether his behavior did not truly indicate that Yeshua was an illegitimate child and the son of a Niddah. Moreover, while they were discussing this, he gave his own impudent interpretation of law, and in ensuing debate, he held that Moses could not be the greatest of the prophets if he had to receive counsel from Jethro. This led to further inquiry as to the antecedents of Yeshua, and it was discovered through this inquiry that he was an illegitimate son of Joseph Pandera, and Miriam admitted it. After this became known, Yeshua had to flee to Upper Galilee. Now in the temple is to be found the foundation stone, in which are the engraved letters of God's ineffable name. Whoever learned the secret of the name and used it would do whatever he wished. And so the sages took measures that no one should gain this knowledge. Lions of brass were bound to the iron pillars of the gate at the place of the burnt offerings, and should anyone enter and learn the name, when he left, the lions would roar, and he would immediately forget his valuable secret. Yeshua came and learned the letters of the name, and he wrote it upon parchment. He opened up a cut in his thigh, drew the flesh over the parchment, and as he left, the lions roars, and he forgot the secret. But when he came to his house, he reopened the cut with a knife and lifted out the writings, and then he remembered and obtained the letters. And then it goes on to explain that the only reason that Jesus, Joshua, was able to perform any miracles because he knew the ineffable name of God and did many things using that. And the only reason that he was able to be captured is because he was made to forget the ineffable name of God. Let's take all that we've learned here. Let's gather together and get a concise picture of this person called Jesus from sources other than the Scriptures. Based on all that we've read, we know that Jesus was born and lived in Palestine. He was born supposedly to a virgin. He had an earthly father who was a carpenter. He was a teacher who taught, and through repentance and belief, all followers would become brothers and sisters. He led the Jews away from their beliefs. He was a wise man who claimed to be God and Messiah. He had unusual magic powers, performed miraculous deeds. He healed the lame. He predicted the future. He was persecuted by the Jews. He was betrayed by a man named Judas Iscarioto, which comes further in the thing I was just reading. That I was brief, believe me. He was beaten with rods, forced to drink vinegar, wear a crown of thorns. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover. It occurred during the direction of Pontius Pilate, during the time of Tiberius. And on the day of his crucifixion, the sky grew dark and there was an earthquake. He was buried in the tomb, and it was later found to be empty. He appeared to his disciples, resurrected, and showed them his wounds. The disciples told others that Jesus was resurrected and ascended to heaven. Jesus and his disciples upheld a high moral code. One of them was named Matthew. The disciples were also persecuted, and they met regularly to worship Jesus even after his death. So there's actually quite a bit that we can discover when we look at writings that are other than biblical. But when you throw in the biblical writings as well, then you have just an enormous body of evidence. According to Professor Yamauchi, who is often interviewed in books put out by Lee Strobel. Ring a bell? Such as the case for Jesus, the case for Christ, the case for faith. When people begin religious movements, it's often not until many generations later that people record things about them. Now keep that in mind because, as I said earlier, 30 years after the death of Christ, as recorded, there are already tons of writings about him. Within that 30-year time, you have even the Gospels being written about him. So we're not talking about hundreds or thousands of years. We're not talking about centuries. We're talking about within a man's lifespan. There are people recording things about this man. One of the most common myths that Jesus is associated with is Zoroaster. I talked about Mithras. Mithras comes from the Zoroaster cult. The Gathis of Zoroaster was about 1000 BC. The most authentic writings they can find were written about the 3rd century AD, with the most popular written about AD 1278. That's who Jesus is often compared to. And the writings were literally centuries apart from the actual occurrence of the religion or the people's start. Buddha, 6th century BC. Writings do not appear until the Christian era. So 6th century BC, his writings, the writings of Buddha and the religion that follows, do not appear until Christianity is already starting into full swing. Muhammad lived from 570 to 632 AD. His biography was not written until 767. So even there you have a full century before religious writings about this man appeared. So even without the New Testament, we have plenty of information that provide an outline for Jesus' life and his ministries. So when we come across people who would compare myths and say that Jesus is just the latest in a long line of those myths, and they discount the Bible because the Bible obviously is pro-Christian, so you can't believe anything it says, you can remove that completely and just take those that would write against Christianity, those people who are bent on its destruction even, to discredit it, and it proves basically the majority of the story as we understand it. So there are evidences that are extra-biblical, that are out there. God gave us so much to work with. There is no other religion, as I said earlier, that has this much information about it, that has this historic timeline, that has this much evidence that is there. So I ask you questions. Based on what we learned last week, and a little bit about, and this week as well, does your understanding of these myths change your faith in Christ? Does your understanding of these myths change your faith in Christ? And second question, do the writings against him change how you view him? And I don't want just yes or no answers. Those are things to discuss, though. Break into cell groups. It's time to wake up and walk around a little bit. And then we'll come back together.